Hello, this is Professor Joseph Holbrook in my ongoing series in Christianity in the Caribbean, a look at how Christians responded to slavery and race and colonialism in the Caribbean between 1500 and the 20th century. And today we're going to continue with part two of our focus on the Ethiopian Baptist of Jamaica. If you remember last week, we talked about George Liele, the American slave who was converted in a Baptist church in South Carolina, was granted his freedom by his owner so that he could travel around and preach freely. He became a very popular preacher in South Carolina and Georgia and founded the earliest black churches, evangelical churches in Savannah, Georgia, and mentored a number of other men who went on to Nova Scotia and Sierra Leone and within a missionary movement. Then he moved to Jamaica with a British colonel, and there with his family started another church in Kingston, Jamaica, which grew over 7 years to almost 500 people with 450 baptisms. And out of that mother church in Kingston, Jamaica, he launched a movement called the Ethiopian Baptist that spread throughout Jamaica in the following centuries and launched basically a Afro-Jamaican Baptist movement that was it wasn't exactly part of the First Great Awakening, but it was one of the ripples going out from the First Great Awakening in the American colonies, and also part of the movement of black people to Christianity in the Caribbean. We've already talked about Rebecca on St. Thomas, and we'll be talking about some others in Trinidad. Today, we'll talk about the Ethiopian Baptist after George Liele. It's important to keep in mind that this is set in the context of the Haitian Revolution of 1791, which created a terrible feeling of threat and insecurity among white plantation owners, sugar producers in Cuba and Jamaica, particularly the Spanish owners in Cuba and the British owners in Jamaica were terrified that a bloody revolution could come to their islands as it did in the French Saint-Domingue, which later became Haiti. And so they were, in Spanish we would say prevenidos. They were on alert and worried about any possible signs of resistance among their slaves. And it appeared to them that the Ethiopian Baptist movement was giving agency and empowering African slaves to take charge of their own lives, giving them hope, giving them a spiritual, theological framework, and this was seen as a threat. I think I talked last week briefly about uh, David George, one of the associates, disciples of George Liele, who became a significant leader in his own right in Jamaica. He led his congregation in a song, and where is it? It's right here somewhere. I have it, and I get lost in my notes. I'm sorry about that. But I read his hymn that was so offensive to the Jamaican authorities. He led the hymn, "Shall we go on in sin because thy grace abounds, or crucify the Lord again and open all his wounds? We shall be slaves no more, since Christ has made us free and has nailed our tyrants to the cross and brought our liberty." This is a hymn by Isaac Watts, a white British Methodist who wrote this hymn, "Shall we go on in sin?" And uh, when Moses Baker led the congregation in this song, it was so offensive and so terrifying to the authorities that they shut down the church. They arrested Moses Baker. They scattered the people and they burned the church down. So this is an example of the kind of response that the Ethiopian Baptists were provoking among the ruling elites. As I said last week, my thesis is that these evangelical sects, the actually beginning before them with the Quakers and then the Moravians and then the Baptists and Methodists, were a threat to the institution of slavery, and because of their uh, empowering of Africans and because of presenting the gospel to the Africans and Afro descendants of slavery in these islands, they were moving the needle away from the original Spanish Catholic and British Anglican and French Catholic views of Christianity and slavery. They were moving the needle towards a view that lifted the slaves and their descendants into a place of human dignity and treated them with some degree of equality and human rights. And so that is my thesis. It's a very slow process, but one of the pieces of evidence is the reaction of the wealthy establishment, and they certainly thought that the Christianity was a threat to the institution of slave owning. So this tension continued between the Ethiopian Baptists, who continued to flourish and to grow despite hostility and resistance from the governing authorities, right up until the Baptist War of 1831. Interestingly, it became known as the Baptist War. Sam Sharpe was the most notorious leader of the Baptist War. He was he heard his first sermon preached by Moses Baker. He himself became a Baptist deacon. He was advocating for the rights of the enslaved, uh, and launched a peaceful protest, which quickly turned into riots. And the one person, Doreen Morrison, in one of her books, describes the Baptist Rebellion as an organized resistance to organized repression. So, for the very first time, not only were the Ethiopian Baptists being subjected to violence and intimidation, but their white Baptist ministers were also. These were missionaries sent out from the London Baptist Missionary Society, who were attempting to assist the Ethiopian Baptists in their explosive missionary movement. But now the white missionaries were also being harassed and receiving the brunt of hostility from the governing elites. They were prevented from holding services and other meetings due to the imposition of martial law, and that included the white missionaries. William Knibb, Knibb, he was the lead Baptist missionary, faced increasing hostility from the missionaries of other denominations, who often accused him and his colleagues of allowing African leadership to thrive through the continuance of what they considered to be syncretism, begun by Liele and his Ethiopian Baptists, while allowing charismatic practices. The worship style of the Ethiopian Baptists was very different than Quakers or Moravians. Of course, the Quakers sat in a circle in silence. The Moravians used hymns and had been known, at least in one period in Germany, to be somewhat enthusiastic in their devotions. However, the Ethiopian Baptists had music that had rhythm to it. They used drums as well as other forms of instruments. There was lifting of hands and praising of Jesus, and what the more staid denominations would call enthusiasms. These were considered to be African in their practices, and somewhat, to some degree, they might be considered by us as proto-Pentecostal. And these were criticized as a form of syncretism with uh, African religions. So to the um, this brings us to the Baptist Wars, in which Sam Sharpe was executed, and a number of the leaders of the rebellion were executed. But this basically sent a powerful message to London that they were not going to be able to continue the institution of slavery without greater and greater forms of brutal repression. And this prompted the Parliament to finally begin the process of abolishing slavery entirely. The Baptist War was from 1826 to 1832, and the final declaration by Parliament of an end to slavery was 1834. And so, in some ways, Sam Sharpe is considered in Jamaica today as a martyr to the cause of abolitionism. And this persecution continued from the 1838 up through the 1860s. Obviously, there was a big social adjustment as slaves learned to work for wages and develop their own farming plots, their own gardens, raising their own food and subsistence agriculture. There was a lot of dislocation and difficulty. It also had implications for the sugar production and the plantations. And this brings us to George William Gordon, who was the son of a Scottish planter, Joseph Gordon, and an enslaved woman, Anne Rattray. And he was one of 8 children. He was the second child of these children. He was self-taught, self-educated. He taught himself to read, write, and to perform simple counting. He was born a slave, but his father gave him his freedom, and at the age of 10, he was allowed to leave the plantation and to go live with his godfather. George became successful in business and eventually married a white widow. In the 1840s, he got involved in politics and was appointed justice of the peace, and later elected a member of the House of Assembly. He helped to establish a Native Baptist church. Native Baptist is another term for Ethiopian Baptists. In 1865, in the lead up to 1865, the Morant Bay Rebellion, there was a large number of ex-slaves who were struggling with poverty and crop failures. There were crippling epidemics of cholera and smallpox. The people of Jamaica, the masses of Jamaica, were suffering mightily, and had actually sent petitions to the Queen Victoria, asking for some relief of taxation and other practices. Gordon himself, George William Gordon, criticized the governor of Jamaica, John Edward Eyre, for his brutality, his draconian punishments such as flogging and the treadmill. The treadmill, by the way, was a punishment developed in Great Britain and used in Jamaica, in which instead of allowing prisoners just to sit idly in jail, they were put on a treadmill. Picture a stair step machine at a fitness center or a gym, a stair step machine, but that you were tied to it so you could never get off. You had to keep walking and walking and stepping up, and the treadmill kept turning, and you were not able to take a break or get off of it whenever you were tired. This was the treadmill. It was a very brutal punishment. There's a reggae song remembering George William Gordon called Innocent Blood. I'll let you look that up and play it on your own, but there's several versions of it on YouTube. It's about George William Gordon, who attempted to address some of these situations through petitions and through political attempts. But then when the riots finally broke out, there was a peaceful attempt at a peaceful protest, a strike, and this led to an overreaction by Governor Eyre and his troops, which then broke into violence. And then, with the support of Jamaican Maroons from Moortown, hundreds of black Jamaican men and women were killed by government forces without a trial, without any due process, or in hastily arranged trials under martial law. In the first day of the riots, Governor Eyre ordered for George William Gordon to be arrested. He was brought to Kingston, and he was, without any due process, he was found guilty and executed immediately, even though there was no real solid evidence that he had anything to do with planning an uprising or leading the uprising. This led to a huge outcry in Great Britain. It was a scandal, an intense public debate over the actions of Governor Eyre, who was believed to have been overreacted and acted lawlessly. with great brutality. The governor was forced to resign, but he never went to trial. Public figures like John Stuart Mill were calling for his trial and calling him a butcher. After the Morant Bay Riot, 1865, of course, this is timed with the end of the Civil War in the United States. After the Morant Bay Riot, the British Missionary Society in London, uh, having been under unrelenting pressure from the white Jamaican uh, elites and ruling elites, began to distance itself from the Ethiopian Baptists and to criticize them for syncretism and for their enthusiasm, their charismatic style of worship, and basically disassociated themselves from the Ethiopian Baptists. The Ethiopian Baptists found themselves facing hostility and persecution alone from the planting class and even from other denominations, and were gradually driven underground or to remote parts of Jamaica. There had been an enduring belief, this is from page 261 of Doreen Morrison's account. There had been an enduring belief in the African Jamaican Christian mythology since Morant Bay that one day their deliverance would come from America. And so it probably was no surprise in 1917 when evangelist J. Wilson Bell sent an invitation to the Church of God, uh, Cleveland, and asked them to come and assist them as missionaries in Jamaica. This was somewhat reminiscent of one sent by George Liele and Moses Baker almost 100 years earlier to the British Missionary Society asking for their help. And so USA Pentecostalism, which is a whole story uh, of uh, of it's a whole story of multiracial worship and gender empowerment in itself, which we will get to in a few weeks. But the USA form of Pentecostalism out of Azusa Street now has arrived in Jamaica. And my own feeling, I'd like a happy ending to the story. My own feeling is that the Pentecostalism, as it arrived in Jamaica, breathed fresh fire into the embers of Ethiopian Baptists and picked up where and carried on where George Liele had so faithfully started 100 years earlier. So that's the story of the Ethiopian Baptist movement and how it was a threat to the ruling class and to even to other denominations, and eventually hung on in the mountains of Jamaica and in remote areas to provide a spark for the Pentecostal movement that was to come. Thank you. God bless you. I'll see you next week when we will talk about the soldier, saints, and slaves of Trinidad. Once again, another group of soldiers who leave the United States after a war with the British, having been uh, promised their manumission from the British, and then are taken to the Bahamas and to Trinidad, where they're given land and become farmers and form Baptist churches. So we will continue next week with the slave soldiers of Trinidad. Thank you very much. See you next.